So hopefully that first part was not on here. So thank you all for coming today. We really, really appreciate it. Please let us know when you arrive and say hi and tell us where you're from, etc. We are usually it should start telling me when people, I think, oh, there we go. Okay, cool. So people are coming in now. So we are Green Juju. We are the best maker of whole food supplements in the pet food industry. My name is Billy. I'm the Vice President of Nutrition and Communication. And this is Kelly Marion. I'm not going to razz you today. So this is
I didn't have anything prepared.
this is Kelly. She's the owner and founder and visionary of Green Juju, and one of, in my opinion, the most innovative formulators in the pet food industry. So we are here today, and we're going to talk about an interesting subject, and that is high pressure processing. And it's something that a lot of people, I think, that are watching this live have heard about. And so, Kelly, I'm going to let you take over on that.
Well, HPP, as most of us know of it, is something that is talked about a lot in the raw or just generally the pet food industry, debated a lot. And Billy and I have both been raw feeders for, nearly a decade, I think now. Um, and we have both formerly come from the no HPP camp. However, we are both into the science and learning and growing, and we've been doing a lot of that lately. And we want to share with you what we've learned recently and hopefully open a discussion around HPP and raw pet food.
And I would like to sort of open that up to just sort of an interesting concept. I think in pet nutrition generally, most of the people who are watching this are understand the value of unprocessed foods and raw foods for dogs and cats, and we often to ourselves wonder, hey, how come this vet who hasn't been, who's against raw feeding for the last 15 years or something like that, how come given all this new evidence they're not changing their mind based on I just lost my train of thought. How come they're not changing their mind now that there's new evidence if they're actually, going by the science? And I think for us as humans, I think that's can be a hard concept. And so we can't necessarily expect that scenario while not expecting to examine sort of our own hardline beliefs. And so I know for me personally, when we approach this subject, I always go by the data and the best data. And I think we're going to show some really interesting data, but the best data available and not maybe what my preconceived idea was or what I want to be true or not to be true. Those things are sort of, in my own personal view, are irrelevant. What is relevant is the data. And so I think changing your mind on something like this can actually is a sign of following the science versus, um, not digging into your old held beliefs.
So I'll just say that for anybody that knows Billy on any level, he loves he loves nutrition and science and just going deep into everything there is to possibly learn about a topic. And so as we present you with this information, you can trust that Billy has done his process on this.
And it's a continuing process. A good example of that is not only did we get a lot of great preliminary data that we're going to share with you, but also I'm going to be attending in March an HPP conference to further educate myself, because that's what we do. We don't just ignore information when we don't want to see it. And so I'm very excited to be able to continue down that road. Um, uh, so Kelly, can you just talk about a little bit about before I bring up the slides here, what we're going to go over in terms of just the general concept of myth versus, what might be the perceived idea versus the reality?
To put it very bluntly, we're going to basically interview our old selves versus our new selves, having learned what we've learned. So sorry, that's the garage downstairs. Just a minute.
Had to have one DIY green juju moment during this, so you're fine.
My office is in a warehouse, and there's a loading dock downstairs. So basically, we're gonna bring up these misconceptions that we had before, and we're gonna talk about them and what we've learned, and we're just gonna go through one after another and tell you what we've learned.
That sounds good. So I'll bring this up, and then uh, Kelly, if you kind of want to introduce the part, and then we can kind of go from there. So let me just. So we know, by the way, it's kind of small. These will be on social media after we're done. We're just not the most tech savvy people in the world, and I don't know how to make it where where this is the biggest one. Right now, I'm the biggest one. So sorry about that, people.
That's okay.
But you will be able to see these on social media. So this is just going to be a reference point while we're here today. So if you want to
Okay.
start that one.
Yep. So myth number one is HPP significantly reduces the nutrients in foods.
So the really interesting thing about this, when we look at the information that I'm about to present here, is there are several ways you can kind of diagnose this specific issue, but also issues with other types of studies. So what that means is there's a lot of really great information, and I do have to give a shout out here in terms of some of this information. To Steve's Real Food internal testing, because that was actually done on pet food. And so some of the stuff we're going to be talking about here was done on actual pet food. Now we can look at studies outside of pet food and look at different industries. But I think that's what the biggest thing that changed my mind when it came to HPP was exactly that was what is the information when we study actual food. So this shows the nutrient testing done on a full nutrient panel showed that not only does it not decrease in food, but it actually 67% of the nutrients actually increase when you're talking about HPP foods. And so I have a theory on that. This is somewhat conjecture, but it's just a theory. So anytime you add a uh, what you could call a processing step to food, be it fermentation, be it HPP, anything like that, you are sort of pre-digesting or pre-processing the food in a way. And so what I think why 67% of the nutrients would actually increase in HPP food, I think that's probably because the pressure actually helps to unlock some of those nutrients in the same way, where it's due to pressure here, but in fermentation, say it would be due to the bacteria eating the food or pre-processing the food. So that's my own theory, but that is an interesting thing because the old criticism here that would come from me or you, um, you know, years ago would have been that the nutrients actually decrease. So only four nutrients, which is vitamin A, retinol, vitamin A, vitamin B5, vitamin B6, and vitamin B12, increase by 20%, which you can very easily make up through your formulation. So basically, what happens is you produce your treats or your food or whatever you're doing, and then you HPP the food, and then you test it and you make sure that your formula has over those amounts, to meet that requirement. So that's not very hard at all. And of the rest of those nutrients, they basically stayed exactly the same. So this is it could be also similar to even when you freeze foods, you get some nutrient loss. So like a good example that would be when you freeze foods, vitamin E. Um, uh, you lose a lot of vitamin E. And that's just in the freezing process. So anytime you're taking fresh food and doing anything to it, and that could be just letting it sit in a room, right, as food rots, or that could be freezing it, or it could be HPPing it, you're going to get some slight at least change. But the good news here is that the nutrients don't decrease in any significant way. And the ones that do, you can very easily just make sure that you formulate to meet those requirements. So the first myth is that the nutrients are reduced, making it not raw, which is not true. Okay.
Just a fun fact that you were kind of touching on. the food that we eat at the grocery stores, if it's been sitting there for a couple of days, I think up to 5 days, it loses 40% of its nutrition just across the board. Um, so, you know, this is happening, processing, non-processing. There is nutrient loss as food ages.
Exactly. And that's a good point too in pertaining to freeze drying. So if you look at our treats or something like that, it's a great way to preserve those nutrients that would be lost in those cases. So we'll go to slide number 2.
All right. Myth. HPP kills all the bacteria in the food, including the good ones, making the food sterile.
So this was obviously one that was near and dear to my heart, and I noticed Jessica Fisher's comment here, and it said, "My understanding that dogs recovering from GI surgery or undergoing immunotherapy would benefit from HPP food." The reason people say that is because they think that HPP food is sterile. This one was the biggest surprise to me in terms of doing that, because logically you'd say to yourself, why, if it's killing bad bacteria, does it not kill good bacteria? Well, it depends on how resistant they are. It also really depends on the amount of pressure and if there's heat accompanying it. Obviously, if there's heat accompanying it, it would um, uh, kill those bacteria. But in raw pet food, and specifically what we're doing, you're talking about keeping it at 41 degrees and doing a sort of low on the lower end of the pressure spectrum. So what they found here, and I'm looking down because I'm referencing my thing here. So basically, when you do HPP, what you're looking to do is reduce by logs the number of pathogenic bacteria. So E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria. So you want to reduce that by um, to is a 6 log reduction, right? Yeah,
5 or
yeah,
6.
yeah. So 2 things here. Number one, they actually found that lactobacillus probiotic bacteria was only reduced by like a smaller log amount. So you are going to lose some of those bacteria, but most of them, say it's a 2 log reduction, actually do still survive that process. So there's a couple interesting ways to unpack this. There was a second study that showed that when yogurt cultures were applied to HPP, that those withstood HPP as well and were viable after the HPP process. There's also good evidence to show that spore-forming bacteria, because those spore-forming bacteria are basically in an environment where they're resisting the outside and things that would damage them, are very resistant to HPP as well. So what we're finding here is that the myth is that these foods are sterile, but we're finding through the evidence here, and a lot of this evidence was very interesting to come by from some of the manufacturers that were doing this, or people that were making products that they wanted to work into raw pet food. So that was a very interesting process. But we're busting this myth because HPP foods are not sterile. They're not in a sterile environment. It's not as if you're killing all the bacteria and then they're reopened to, you know, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not a sterile environment, so they're reopened to bad bacteria growing after that, because we know that. Then there's 2 other points on this one. Number one, there isn't a lot of probiotic bacteria in meat anyway. There's basically no probiotic. There's bacteria, there's background flora, but there's nothing that we understand as probiotics in meat anyway. So it's not like the background flora that are not good or bad necessarily are going to survive and that has health benefits. But I don't want people to think that you are getting a lot of probiotic benefit from, you know, heart that's been HPP'd or something like that. And then the other part about this is, again, it just goes back to processing. So you may be saying to yourself, well, I don't want any reduction in good bacteria, but that's not possible either, because even when you freeze things, it goes back to, you lose some of it. You do lose some of it. This is actually a really good reason why you should buy our milk and ferment it, because then you don't have to, you're not freezing it after it's fermented. So you can, and it'll still be viable. But and I know this because I've seen the data on it. Um, when you take, say, when you make a kefir and then you just make it from fresh milk and then test it, it's going to be higher in bacteria than one that you make and then freeze it. And that's because you do lose some of those residual bacteria to the freezing process. So again, it goes back to what we were talking about in the last slide. Every step is going to do something. In HPP, through this evidence that we're showing here, um, absolutely does not make the food sterile. And what we're finding is that the good bacteria actually do survive, which again was the biggest shock to me. But I think it's really cool to find out that new information.
All right.
All
Next
right. So myth number 3.
HPP denatures enzymes.
So this is another one too. When we look at raw foods, people typically judge them by um, are the enzymes still active? Is the bacteria still active? Are the nutrients denatured like cooking? So we've already talked about the nutrients are not denatured like cooking. We've already talked about the bacteria do survive this, to be able to do that. But now we're going to talk about the enzymes, and that's another big one because part of the reason we feed raw foods and raw treats and things like that is because we want to maintain this enzyme activity. And enzymes are very important, not only for your body, your dog or cat's body producing enzymes in the pancreas, but also in supplying those, so they don't have to do that as much, and so we can support them in that way. And this is a very, very easy one. There was 2 studies that we looked at, and one of them they found a 10% reduction in the specific enzyme that they were testing. And the second study found no reduction. Both of those were in raw pet food. And so you're basically, if you're talking about at the very worst, a 10% reduction, you're still talking about raw food with totally active enzymes. So you're talking about what we're all looking for in terms of that. So that's kind of an easy one. And in the second study, they actually showed there was almost a protective effect over the enzymes as well, which I thought was very interesting. So the third myth is that HPP foods aren't raw because they denature the enzymes, which is just untrue.
All right, moving on to number 4. HPP oxidizes fats, making them rancid.
Okay, so there is some relevance to this, but not in HPP pet food. So the first thing is that's not actually listed on the slide, which I think is interesting, is you can actually you reduce the oxidizing of the fats when you reduce the oxygen actually in the container that it's HPP'd in. So when it's in raw pet food and it's done in, say, chubs or something like that, there is no air in the product between the actual chub and the meat itself. So that has been shown to reduce oxidizing of the fats, and also it depends on the heat and the pressure and the length. So it depends on what industry you're in, but sometimes they do these tests on like, 20 minutes of pressure. In pet food, we're talking about doing 2 minutes of pressure, and we're talking about 41 degrees. So longer pressure at higher temperatures definitely does oxidize fats, but that's not exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about a lower pressure. We're talking about 41 degrees. And it's mainly because most HPP in other industries, like a lot of it, they pair it with heat. And so obviously that's 2 different things. If you're HPPing food and then cooking it, we're not advocating for that. We're advocating for HPP as raw in terms of that aspect of it. And so basically, to conclude that the level that uh, pet food is typically done, or say the green Juju treats are done, is going to be at 41 degrees for 2 minutes, which is not going to oxidize the fats in the actual product. So you have raw and healthy fats after the HPP process is done.
All right. Last but not least, myth number 5. HPP lowers the food's digestibility.
This is a really easy one. So digestibility, in terms of how you measure that, is how the body can break down all of those macronutrients and nutrients into usable nutrients. And thanks to some actual pet food testing here, there is literally no difference in digestibility between HPP and non-HPP foods. That's the easiest test to do. You just take whatever your product is before it's HPP'd and send it to a lab and then send it after. And this consistently has come back as the same digestibility. And that really kind of, in my opinion, encompasses everything that we've talked about up to this point. So we talked about, enzymes, we talked about, bacteria, we talked about the nutrient percentage, we talked about all these things, which is all of those things comprise what makes food digestible. And now we can, it's almost like in a weird way performing like a meta study of all those things, because all those things contribute to digestibility, and we can actually measure the full on digestibility. So I just want to um, reiterate that fact about the last myth here, is that there is no difference in digestibility between HPP and non-HPP foods. And no one was more surprised by all of this data than myself. So um, and then we do have one more slide here just to show you, just to give you a visual here. Again, these will be online too, in terms of uh, some HPP protocols in other industries can actually go up to 194 degrees Fahrenheit, which is obviously cooking the food. And we show you right there at Green Juju um, where we're at in that process, which is 41 degrees. The other thing that's interesting here was a misconception I know that I had for a very long time, was that the pressure process is so intense that there's a lot of heat um, produced there, and it heats up the food by nature of doing that, which is totally untrue. It only goes up like 1 to 2 degrees during that actual process. Um, so that kind of, was a big discovery for myself as well. So I'm going to go back into
So,
us two here.
okay. So, with all this being said, why are we talking about this? We are talking about this because Green Juju has always been about transparency. And we think it's important to let you guys know what we know and what we're learning. And we are not here to sell you on anything. If, you know, we were in the no HPP camp, we learned a lot. If you stay in that camp, that's fine. We're not trying to sell you. We use different food safety measures on our other products. This only applies to our freeze dried meat products. Um, and we just believe, as a manufacturing company and a growing one at that, it's very important to us to produce safe food. And we believe that this is a safe way to keep raw food. I see someone in the comments made a comment about, would sous vide be better? Sous vide's a great way to gently cook a food. However, you are introducing heat to do that, which does reduce some of the nutrients and ways that we weren't looking to do with our raw freeze dried foods. Um, so yeah, we're just here to be transparent, tell you guys what we're learning, and this applies to our raw freeze dried foods.
Well, and I think too, as the industry progresses, you're going to see sort of more and more of this in terms of like what the government is willing to accept, and that aspect of it. And so, for me, I wanted to make sure, okay, we do these amazing formulations, and I want to make sure, hey, what is happening when we do this process? And, I think it really opens it up too for everyone watching this, and if you're a retail store, it really opens it up as well, because I know there's been two camps for so long, but now maybe we can all kind of come together and say like, hey, maybe you have a preference, but both of these are raw foods, and both of these are really great options. And some people will be more comfortable with the safety aspect of this, and some people are looking for other aspects of it. And so I really view this as, number one, a way for us to sort of come together on that. But number two, I think you hit the nail on the head with the transparency thing. At Green Juju, we're always going to let you know exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it, because it matters to us that you know what you're feeding your animal. So there was no way, that we weren't going to sort of seek the best information and then present it to you guys. So that's kind of why we're here today.
And we want to open this discussion across other brands, across the industry. We were lucky to get a lot of this information from Steve's Real Food, who did a lot of this initial study, but a lot of brands HPP and just don't talk about it because they're afraid to. And it shouldn't be like that. There's nothing to be afraid of here. And we wanted to open that up and hopefully help retailers, hopefully help brands, hopefully open this discussion to be something that, it's not something to be afraid of. This is still great raw food. This is still great stuff to feed your dog or cat.
Exactly right. So hopefully this is the start of a better conversation. We are going to have some graphics up. So if you guys want to share those, that would be really cool to kind of get people to talk about this. And lastly, on my end, I'll say this has been a real journey for, I think us both, and particularly I can speak for myself in this process. But I think I think we'll be in a better place moving forward. And if you guys have any questions about this or any questions about what we do and why we do it, we are always here to answer. You can email us at info@greenjuju.com, and we are happy to give you any of the information. And the other thing too is this is always evolving. So that's the thing about nutrition science, is it's always evolving into new areas. And like I said, in preparation for some of this, I had a meeting with a couple PhDs. I'm going to this conference to learn more about this, and there's some tours involved and things like that. So it's always going to be a process that we're continually looking into. So if you guys ever have any questions, want to chat about it, just reach out to us anytime.
Thank you for coming, guys. We appreciate your support and taking the time to listen.
Absolutely. As always, we genuinely appreciate the fact that you guys trust us with your pet's health. So thank you guys very much, and we will talk soon.
Goodbye.